Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks very much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on the legacy of feminist work in UK psychology, which coincides with International Women's Day tomorrow. So my name is Sophie O'Reilly. I'm the archivist at the British Psychological Society History of Psychology Centre. And before we get started, we will be having questions at the end of the webinar. So if you could put any questions you have during the talk in the chat, and we'll then collate these for the end, and we'll have sort of 15 minutes for any questions at the end. And the chat function, I believe, can be found at the top of the taskbar bar. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to the British Psychological Society's History of Psychology Centre before we get started. So the History of Psychology Centre promotes research and knowledge creation on the history of UK psychology, and it manages and develops the BPS's extensive historical collections known as the archive. And we recently had a report written about the archive by external consultants who concluded that the BPS has a rich archive that provides a detailed and unique narrative of the history of psychology in the UK after the last century. So it's quite a significant collection, especially on psychology. And we are made up of BPS staff and volunteers, and we undertake collaborative projects, of which I'll talk a bit more about at the end. So within the History of Psychology Centre, as I've said, we hold historical collections. So what is in our archives? So our collections date from the 19th century to the present day. And this includes BPS organisational papers. So these are things like boards and committee papers, policy papers, things to do with member networks, BPS events. But whilst we have BPS papers, and that's a large part of our collection, we also have papers on the wider history of UK psychology as well. So these can be things like oral histories. We have over 200 oral histories with prominent UK psychologists over the past 100 years. We have further audiovisual material. So those are things like images, recordings. We also have individual psychologists, personal and professional papers, which have been donated to us. We have psychological tests. And we also have library material, to name but a few things we have in our collection. So before I pass on to Rose, Catherine and Lois from the BPS Psychology of Women and Equality section, I'll just give a bit of background about the project today. So the aim of their project was really to protect the legacy of feminist work in UK psychology and to assure a wider access to this history. And they conducted a series of video recorded oral histories and collected archival material as part of this project. And they started this a few years ago now, and it was funded by the BPS with their work. So we were really glad to help them with their work. So I will pass over to Rose to talk a bit more about their project.
Okay, unmute, got that right? Okay. Hi, so I'm Rose Capdevila from the Open University, and I'm just going to do a bit of background about our project, and then I'll hand over to Catherine and Lois to talk about the project itself. So in her book, Living a Feminist Life, Sarah Ahmed says, citation is feminist memory. Citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before, those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow. And I think in the most literal sense, this is about the role of academic citation. But I think the quote from Ahmed also has, apart from the literal meaning, has this kind of notion of memory and how important it can be for memory to be made visible or to be obscured. And I think most psychologists are aware memory can be a very problematic concept. Isabel Piper, however, has done extensive work around memory and memorialization. And she's spoken about how, for instance, monuments or exhibitions function to shape memory, most often reascribing normative gender and power relations, which is, one of the things we want to avoid. But so with the potential to inscribe new ways of remembering, and that is part of the motivation for our project. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to say a few words about the various forms of feminist organizing that we've seen in psychology. And while there are obviously women working in psychology well before this, the kind of organizing in psychology kind of began with whips. And there's a poster here from their first conference, which is the one in black and white on the setting. And that was the document they went on, the setting up of an organization for the psychology of women. And Whips of Women in Psychology, they did the first conference in November 1985. They worked towards creating POWES. And then POWES itself, the Psychology of Women, was formed in 1987 after a number of failed attempts. Won't go into that too much here, but there were interesting reasons for that. There's a lot to say about the term psychology of women, and I think I and others have written about that. But just for now, I just want to say it's not without its controversy. So a few years ago, the section changed its name to the Psychology of Women and Equality section to mark its commitment to an inclusive and intersectional feminism. Then we have the symbol for feminism and psychology. That was the launch of the first big UK feminist journal, International Now, in February of 1991. It was set up as separate to the BPS so that it could include other kinds of things, but also so it could explicitly use the word feminist in its title, which was not possible for POWES. And then I have a little symbol from POWES of Power, Psychology of Women Equalities Review. We had, those are the journals associated with the section. And Psychology's Feminist Voices, something that came up more recently, and we'll talk more about that later because that's part of what our project is feeding into. So yeah, and so that's an oral history project and that we're contributing to. And then I have two little images of some of the activism. So one of the things was when Trump came to visit the Queen in Windsor, the POWES conference takes place in Windsor. We happened to be there, so we made a big sign and some people took it to Windsor. I'm sorry if you're a Trump supporter. And then we also had a small campaign against fat phobia. There, in response to the kind of, there was a campaign that said obesity is the cause of cancer. And we produced this kind of alternative version pointing out the critical role of poverty in many health outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, so not going to go too much about this. There's always been a tight relationship between the activities and activism of POWES. It's not intended as an academic organization specifically, and we welcome practitioners and activists of different kinds. So that's just a little selection. So we do, our conferences are kind of big ticket thing that everyone enjoys and likes to come to, but we have publications, we have an online presence, we do writing retreats, and our activist takes many forms, including feeding back to Parliament around gender and gendered violence, also around class. And we do media engagement, and some of our members are big fans of craftivism. And that's a picture of a load of felted vulvas, I believe. So anyway, okay, next one, please. So there's lots of ways to tell the history of POWES, and I've chosen to do it. So I've just chosen to do it through the conferences. As I say, the conferences are a real place of bonding for POWES members, and it's a real place where people check in. And when you talk to POWES members, they often cite that the conference is something that's very important to them. So I've got there the conference from 1985. That's the first Women in Psychology conference that was held. It was a one-day conference. It was the result of some postgraduate students who went to the social section conference and kind of found each other and went, wow, we should try doing something together around the work around women. And they had this conference in 1985 in Cardiff. The next kind of stopping point here is the 1995 conference. Now that was the 10th anniversary of the Women in Psychology conference, as it was called. And it was, okay, on that occasion, Erica Berman was asked to present a keynote on the history of POWES. And in a chapter that Erica wrote for the Handbook of International Feminism, she reflected on the event. And she talks about the paper having gained a very heated reception. Now, that was the first conference I ever went to, not the first POWES conference, the first conference I ever went to. And a heated reception is an understatement. there was quite a lot of emotion running quite high. And that was interesting. And I think that conference became what in developmental psychology, around Tanya Sadoun sometimes refers to this moment as a transitional moment for the section. And I think the section changed, and in our research that reflected in a lot of people's experiences. And Erica, reflecting on her talk some years later, said one significant impact of the event was that the POWES committee subsequently prioritized making the conference a comfortable and supportive place for participants, which it remains to this day. And in reflection, we've talked about, what that representation and the event itself, I'm not sure, but what it was, it seemed to be quite a catalyst from a kind of move from what was second wave feminism to third wave feminism for the section. And this kind of movement took a different kind of, maybe a gentler kind of feminism. And I moved now to the 2006 and 2007 conferences. That's when we moved to Cumberland Lodge. That was a kind of big movement for the section. 2007 was the 20th anniversary of the formation of the section. It became the first time the conference started consistently being called the POWES Conference, the Psychology of Women Section Conference, rather than the Women in Psychology Conference. So that was a move. And then 2017 was the 30th anniversary. It was still at Cumberland Lodge. And I'm stopping there because that's kind of where our story begins. That was the 30th anniversary conference. And it was about looking back while moving forward. And I think that's a theme that we've held on to. So next slide, please. Okay. So this is our first study that we did. So we've been working together about 6 years, and we've been exploring experiences of POWES and feminist activism in psychology, primarily in the UK, and that's what we're here to talk about. So we first started discussing this for the 2017 30th anniversary conference. Catherine and I had worked together previously on an interactive resource around conceptual and historical issues in psychology, and we were keen to work together again. I think as Roz Gill has pointed out, despite a wealth of work on reflexivity, the actual everyday experiences of academics have largely gone without critical attention. And we knew that POWES-R was looking at, that's the section journal, was looking at reflections from past chairs and founding members. And we thought it would be interesting to collect some data about people's everyday experiences of POWES. In fact, in the early days, we called it Everyday POWES. So we got a little money from the OU. We brought Lois on board. Joined the team, and we wanted to hear about what POWES members had to say about their experiences of POWES on its 30th anniversary, the history of feminist activism, and the future of feminist activism. And the data we collected on that study was overwhelmingly positive about POWES and people's experiences of POWES, as you would expect. It's a self-selected sample, right? So, however, we did find interesting areas for exploration around kind of past reflections, radical futures, and challenges. I won't talk about that too much now. There's the paper in the reference for that paper that we wrote on it. Next slide, please. The second study, after the conference, we decided we wanted to continue the research and went about organizing interviews with those participants who said they'd be interested and interviewed. And in that study, we explored we explored the kind of the boundaries between activism and academia, the provision of support. There's a real culture of support that's, I think, very feminized, a real culture of care in POWES. And kind of different approaches to the production of knowledge, very gendered approaches to kind of gladiatorial, knowledge production, or the kind of more reflexive approach. And these are all kind of, I think, crucial considerations for feminist practice. Again, I won't talk more about that. That's the paper, and we're happy to answer questions. The next slide, please. So then we move from that to kind of the legacy of feminist work, which is the project we'll be talking about now. And we got really excited. We thought this would be a good thing. And this has been funded by the BPS and a little bit by the Open University where I work. And what it does, as Sophie said, it aims to contribute to the collection and archiving of material and documents about the history of POWES, as well as the kind of the development of feminist psychology in the UK. So those are the specific things that we're doing, and you'll hear more about those. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So our deliverables on this project are around the History of Psychology Center, as Sophie's been talking. So we've been collecting, contributing to the existing archives on that. An Open Learn Investigating Psychology resource, which is an interactive resource that the OU does, that's open access for everyone about the history of psychology that Catherine and I had worked on previously. And also, as I mentioned really briefly, Psychology's Feminist Voices, for which we're developing a bespoke exhibit on POWES and UK feminist psychology, which is where I hand over to Catherine, who will tell you more about that archive. So.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, please let me apologise for not having a very cool purple background. As we were setting up for this, I tried to do it and it just makes my face purple. So that's why I don't have the cool background on, but just imagine that for me. Yeah, so as Rose said, our project kind of has two kind of key streams to it. We're focusing on both materials in terms of oral histories and also materials that we can contribute to the BPS archive with Sophie as the archivist. The key thing that we're really trying to do is to collect this history, work collaboratively with the BPS History of Psychology Centre and with Psychologists' Feminist Voices, and basically preserve materials for future research. What we're really aiming to do is kind of ensure a feminist legacy and make sure that feminist work doesn't get forgotten. So we're really trying to create collections and archive materials that are able to be used for the future. So we're not only remembering the kind of feminist past that we've had, but we're also trying to ensure a kind of feminist recognition. So feminist psychologists in the future can go to the archive and find the materials that's relevant to them. On the left-hand side here, you can see our recruitment poster that we utilised for the materials, and both in relation to, you know, the archival stuff, and also we obviously invited people to take part in the oral histories as well. This was a very POWES based, but that isn't to say that we didn't collect materials that was beyond POWES. So we are interested in feminist psychology more broadly, but it was basically a key site through which to kind of collect stuff, talk to people, and use those kind of organizational links that we all have as well. We were especially interested in materials that were pre-2002, if possible, just because that seemed to be a particular area of the archive that was sort of already lacking. So in our talks with Sophie and Sophie's predecessor, we were really keen on making sure we weren't necessarily creating duplicates for what's already in the archive and the collection, but what we could contribute that was kind of new, and, you know, generally enrich the archive and make sure that there was quite a large feminist presence within it. So that's kind of what we were aiming to do. As I say, we had these two approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit about oral histories, but not a lot, because Lois is going to go into that in more detail. I'm mainly going to focus on the material aspect of it. So either the physical and the digital materials that we collected that we are now deposited at the BPS. So what's important to recognise, though, is that fundamentally, whilst this project is about collation and it's about archiving and it's about collaboration, it's not a research project in the kind of strict sense we might think of as research projects. So we aren't conducting analysis on the materials that we've, you know, found and collected and, you know, collated together as such. It's very much a project in order to do this collection work to allow that research to happen in the future. So the work that me and Lois are about to sort of talk through isn't analytical as such, as kind of descriptive about what we have and what the BPS is now going to have access to, and everyone will have access to via the collection at Leicester. Sophie, if you could go to the next slide for me. When we were collecting the materials, both the oral histories and the kind of physical and digital materials, we found that there was kind of both expected and unexpected things. So unsurprisingly, we had a lot of content come to us that was all about the kind of conferences. So we had conference programs, obviously the official documentation from POWES and other organizations. You know, this included communications, committee minutes, things like that. And this was great and really valuable to the archive. And this was the kind of thing that perhaps we were expecting. We were also expecting, obviously, to gain the oral histories. So we chose people for the oral histories on the basis that had they already contributed to oral histories, whether that's being in Psychologists' Feminist Voices or the BPS collections already. We were really looking for people who had not already had that opportunity to contribute their own stories. So we were talking to people through various different links for that. So we were expecting those things. But there was also some unexpected things that were given to us and we've been able to archive, which has been really exciting. So I'm going to kind of talk throughout some of these as both the expected and the unexpected aspects. So we not only got the kind of key documents and official documents, but we also recognized that people gave us, via the oral histories, you know, stories and their own personal narratives. We got a certain richness of the archive. And one of the things that I was really struck by was some of the ephemera that we got for the archive as well. So this mug here, for example, is just one example of that ephemera. That isn't, you know, paper-based documents, but those extra things that kind of enrich an archive and give you a sense of what an organization or what a community, what kinds of feminism were being enacted at the time. So this is a old Psychology of Women section mug before it became Psychology of Women and Equality section. And it says on the left, on the side of the mug, "I think, therefore I am a feminist." So, you know, a kind of play on that René Descartes quote. Can we go to the next slide, please? As Rose has indicated, a lot of our research so far really highlighted how important the conference was to a lot of feminist psychologists in the UK. So the POWES conference really being highlighted as a key annual event that actually contributed to a great deal of the kind of emotional fulfillment for some feminist psychologists. There's a strong sense often that the conference was personal and, you know, it was like an event of coming home when you go to the annual conference every year. And so, you know, conference proceedings, conference abstracts, that was an expected part of what we were going to gain. And we knew that the conferences were so important based on our previous research. And here is just some examples of the posters and leaflets and things that we have now got for the archive that show kind of the different formats the conferences took and the kind of illustrations that they were represented by. So the one on the left, the one on the right, sorry, the purple and green and white one, this is actually the poster for the very first conference from 1985, the one that took place in Cardiff. This is obviously a picture of the conference poster, but what's interesting is that we don't have the original poster for the archive collection because the poster was so personal and important to the person who wanted to share it with us that they've kept the poster. And we said, that's fine, just give us an image of the poster. And it just shows how important and valuable these things are for individuals. So we're very pleased to have the image for that. I think that says a great deal. And then Alliance of Women in Psychology, again, earlier, had this one from 1997, that, you know, challenging the backlash against feminism. And then this is also the 1994 poster for Women in Psychology, which I think that these kinds of images give you a real sense of what these conferences were like and a little bit more illustrative examples of the kind of atmosphere and the sort of subjectivity, if you like, of the kinds of feminism being enacted. This tells us a bit more about the context in which these conferences took place and also the creativity behind the development and design of such posters. If you could go to the next slide, Sophie. Now, I'm sure that Rose would find this incredibly embarrassing that I'm bringing this up as an example for everyone. But one of the other things that is both expected and unexpected in the collections that we found is basically you can really trace feminist psychologists and their involvement within POWES and outside of it through the materials and through the collections that we now have. So while I was going through some of the materials, I basically found Rose in the archive, which I just think was this incredible moment to recognize the feminist legacies that actually, you know, we all have in feminist psychology, but say Rose in particular has, as being involved in this project and being involved in POWES for so long. And so what we have here is the very first moment where Rose kind of pops up in the archive. This is on the left, where she's first kind of expressing an interest in being involved in POWES and getting involved in being on the committee. As Rose said, her first ever conference was POWES, and that was in 1995. So quite soon after that, she's getting quite involved. We then see her nomination form and Karen and Joe supporting her application basically for being onto the committee. And then we then later on see in the notes written by Secretary Helen what the committee is now, who makes up the committee at the moment, and then the kind of official recognition that Rose is then within the committee. And I think this is really nice because obviously this is an expected aspect of the archive collection, that you have those official moments of recognizing when people come in and who's involved. But it also really demonstrates the kind of uncovers a personal history here. And that's really wonderful to kind of see, because we're tracing our feminists through the archive, and it's about our histories as feminists and the legacies that they have. And so we also persuaded Rose to do an oral history for this project as well. So we've even further contributed to Rose's kind of establishment within this feminist history. Next slide, please. One of the absolutely most prominent sort of aspects that we got in the collection of this was pictures. So loads of people wanted to send us images that they had taken around POWES or conferences or elsewhere. And this was really interesting because, again, it gives a certain aspect of life and liveliness outside of the official documents. So these pictures are obviously expected to be around kind of official events, which these ones show in particular, but they also do something more than that. So I think that these convey atmosphere and ethos of POWES and the communities, and the fact that people were taking photos and so excited to share photos says a lot about the kind of feminist action happening within psychology at this point in time. So these are really conveying, I think, meaning and attention to how one might experience one of the conferences. This also includes obviously panel events, people enjoying the kind of area around the conference. This is at Cumberland Lodge, one of the main rooms at Cumberland Lodge where the conference takes place. But there's also an image in the bottom right-hand corner of the writing retreat as well, and one of the activities in there. If we can pop to the next slide. So while official kind of at conference photos might be quite expected, we also got sent, which might be unexpected in some aspects, we also got sent loads of photos of people basically doing something a bit different and outside of academia within the conference space or outside of the conference space. It became really apparent that seriously important friendships with people were forged over this space, and there was a great deal of enjoyment and fun involved in being in and around POWES and in and around other feminists as well. So obviously Rose has talked about the dump Trump image, but there's also yoga at the writing retreat, collections of people from different universities having fun at the POWES disco. I didn't know whether to include an image that had everyone in very elaborate wigs or not. And then there was also the year that if anyone was there, is remembered very fondly as like basically the year that Marcia brought a selfie stick, and there was maybe selfie pictures of absolutely every single person that had been at that conference, which is just hugely fun, and they bring back memories and as well for the people who were there. So we have this kind of, the images do a lot to illustrate the conference and the community that we're talking about, but these were both kind of quite expected, formal in a way pictures, and also really informal pictures, and I think that says a lot. And then next slide, please. And the final example I want to give is a little bit more about the ephemera of the community that we're sort of talking about and we're involved in. And one of the most sort of significant ones within the collection is that of tote bags. So I love a tote bag. I think that this is a really fascinating part of this community, and obviously tote bags kind of have quite a, this isn't just within feminist communities that tote bags become quite prominent, and they're very popular as a kind of material, obviously to give at conferences and stuff as well. But I think that these objects that are outside of often what is considered traditional archival materials tell us so much about the community and the context in which they're existing and how they're working with. So just like how today we're here because of it being associated with International Women's Day, there's a tote bag for International Women's Day 2015. There's, as expected, Psychology of Women's section tote bags, BPS tote bags, and also Sage Publishing tote bags, and that's because of the association to the journal Feminism Psychology. There's also tote bags linked to UCU and the kind of strike action going around at the moment, going on. So this kind of tells us a little bit more about the kind of context and important organisations and movements that people in POWES have been linked to and associated with. And all in all, while we've got all of the important official documents, what I'm really trying to highlight here is there's also a lot of materials that are incredibly personal, and that personal is also really important. So to just think a bit more about the personal aspects, I'm now going to move over to Lois, who's going to talk about the oral history.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so I'm Lois, and I'm based at the University of Worcester. So as Catherine said, I'll just be talking through the oral history side of our project in a bit more depth. So I learned a lot about oral history through courses run by the British Library. So I have to thank them for the information that I've gathered here. So essentially, what is an oral history? In the singular, an oral history is a spoken memoir, but it's also more of a general historical process and methodology as well. So oral histories might contain facts, but they're also a representation of culture because they include memory and ideology. So we can use them to kind of track societal changes and the ways that people perceive events as well. Also, oral histories are more about lay people rather than history's traditional focus on politics and the struggle of power. So it aims more towards a discovery of history that means something to ordinary people. Next slide, please. So oral history is important because it adds to our understanding of the past and also its interaction with the present, especially regarding kind of everyday life and the experiences of the marginalized in society. Oral history allows an exploration of poorly documented or poorly preserved areas of the past. And it's also an interactive process between the interviewer and interviewee. So questions can be more aimed at specific themes and issues and really get into those potentially poorly documented places. So that is an aspect of oral histories that's different to other types of personal testimonies, such as kind of autobiographies. Also, oral history can not only tell us literal narrations, but also what the person wanted or believed in that moment, and also what they remember now. So that's what makes it interesting. There are, of course, criticisms of oral history, which include that, memories are unreliable and subjective and might even be changed due to exposure to media over time and so on. But traditional examination of documents, such as kind of government reports, the census, those kind of things, are seen as more factual and objective. But really, those sources also include their own biases, where judgments can be made in their creation as well as in their selection and their understanding of them. And also situations can be underrepresented in documents. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll now talk about a very important and relevant example of oral history being archived, which Rose has already touched on. So Psychology's Feminist Voices is an online or digital archive of past and presence of women and feminism in psychology. And it's directed by Alex Rutherford at York University in Toronto. This is their website address if anyone wants to go and visit. It's very good. So PFE have a lot of great resources on there, including teaching resources and exhibits, but they also have a wealth of oral histories. So they say on their website that we conduct oral history interviews with feminist psychologists to document, preserve, and explore the relationship between feminism and psychology. We hope that these first-hand accounts not only shape history, but also inspire new generations of feminist psychologists. So this kind of helps us basically understand the shifts in psychology that have occurred over the last 60 years and helps us be aware of our feminist history. So PFE have oral histories with over 100 feminist psychologists from all over the world. And that even includes some POWES founders, such as Sue Wilkinson, Jan Burns, and Jane Usher. So essentially, through our project, we really wanted to contribute to this resource through our project, with a focus more on the UK feminist psychologists. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to our oral histories then in this project. We ended up with 13 participants in all. So those were Ros Gill, Chris Griffin, Sonia Livingston, Susie Orbach, Lynn Siegel, Valde Wogdien, Meg John Barker, Virginia Brown, Helen Melson, Anna Rodosoftir, Victoria Clark, Erica Berman, and our own Rose Capdevila. So we had approached a number of people, and these were the ones who agreed to take part at the end. And we chose people to contact by comparing to the list of people who were already kind of archived on PFE and also BPS's History of Psychology Centre. So to aim to fill those kind of gaps. We used a semi-structured interview schedule covering topics such as academia, their work, activism and POWES, and the future feminism and psychology. And it was, I conducted these online over Zoom, and each one was around 1.5 hours each, and they were all video recorded. So I'm now just going to talk through some of the key areas that we covered by looking specifically at 3 of our participants. So that's Sonia, Chris, and MJ. I'm focusing on them because they've all signed the Creative Commons license to allow their transcripts and videos to be in the public domain. Next slide, please, Sophie. Lovely. So in general, looking first at people's entrance into psychology, interviewees kind of described their journey into psychology as fairly uncertain, unsure of exactly what they wanted to do at such a young age. And connected to this was that many were involved with feminism and activism in their life before their degrees, but not necessarily within the field. So for instance, Sonia says, I read Spare Rib, I went on the marches, I read Our Bodies, Ourselves, I tried to track down women scientists or notable women. So there was a certain kind of way of growing up as a feminist. But I think when I got to UCL to study psychology, I don't think any of that was there. So that's really interesting, seeing that pattern. And what was very common was a feeling that they weren't expecting the focus of mainstream psychology and the emphasis on experiments. Many interviewees were kind of relieved when they discovered a different path or community within psychology, particularly a feminist one. So Sonia says, I think I wasn't bothered that it was a fairly traditional department. I found other spaces. So for a long time, I thought about gender, and then eventual PhD project was very deliberately about gender with a feminist lens. Next slide, please. So we spoke about POWES with our interviewees, and some were what we would call part of the kind of founding group, particularly Chris Griffin and Erica Berman. So many felt that POWES was one of those kind of important community spaces for feminist psychology. And Chris suggested that this was her rationale for getting involved with setting it up. Although the BPS was perhaps an organisation that she wasn't fully invested in. So she says, I think I was involved in those early meetings about whether to do this and how to do it. And I was never in the BPS or bothered about it. But I supported the idea. I thought it was important to have conferences and for some sort of support and so on. So it's really interesting being able to track people's involvement with POWES through these oral histories. Next slide, please. I wanted to briefly move to look at already existing oral histories with POWES founders, which are from the PFE archive, so that we can see more fully the kind of journey of POWES being created, as well as the importance of the space and the community to the founders. So Sue says, the proposal for a section was turned down by the BPS. It was the first time in its history that a section proposal had ever been rejected. I think the essence of it was that there's no recognised area of psychology that's about women. This is just a women's group, a political organisation in disguise. Next slide, please. So Jan Burns suggests that POWES today might lack a radical outlook due to that kind of tension with the BPS. She says it's not as radical as you'd like it because it's in that institution, but it gives a sense of community. It gives us a forum for a lot more feminist work, psychology feminist work to be done. The profile of feminism in psychology has been done great services by it. So this is where we can see that importance of community, networks, and encouragement from others come in as important. And as Chris said in her interview, when she was first starting out, there were few feminist psychology theories existing at the time, and POWES was a space for discussion as well as an institutional space for women in psychology. Next slide, please. So these thoughts were reflected by Jane Ussher as well, who said that creating POWES, it was very empowering because we actually got the establishment to recognise it and take us seriously and give us a place within the establishment. It was a really significant thing in my life, actually. So as Jane says, setting up POWES was both personal and professional. Next slide, please. So coming back to this project's oral history interviews, many of those found POWES to be a welcoming and vital space. So as MJ says, it just felt kinder than any other conference I've ever been to. You just felt really welcomed. It's also a space where people have the opportunity to discover other aspects and methods of psychology, as well as people and networks with whom they had interest or characteristics in common. So for MJ, because I've got a Northern background and a mixed class background, coming across working class and Northern feminist psychologists was just really important to me. It was like finding a way to bring those things together about myself. And people also described POWES as advocating for important issues, especially within the academy. Next slide, please. So my favourite topic of the interviews was about people's advice for future feminist psychologists. And these often highlighted kind of the difficulty and tension that's perhaps inherent in feminist psychology because it's not mainstream, as well as revolving around the idea of community and finding others like you as being essential. So Sonia says, go for it, enjoy it, but watch your back, probably. Feminist advice to psychologists might be more kind of practical, finding mentors, identifying where support structures are, being ready to join others' fights. Next slide, please. So Chris focuses more on the theoretical and encourages persistence in criticality. So she says, I'd say make feminism your base, not psychology, and survival is resistance, and thinking critically is resistance as well. Next slide, please. And MJ says, the system is broken, not you. They state that future psychologists might need to be part of a community that validates their personality and positionality and their interests, as well as create a more hospitable environment. So that was a really brief overview of our oral history collection, which will be archived with the PFE and the BPS History of Psychology Centre. So hopefully they'll be available for you to watch at some point soon. And yeah, I hope that's kind of given you a little peek into what we've got and how interesting they are. So I'll now pass over to Rose for some final conclusions.
I don't know how much of a conclusion it's going to be, but I'll say a few words. So I think there was a very adverse environment when POWES was set up, as Sue says, being the first section to be rejected. It was initially rejected because I think potentially well-meaning idea that feminist work women should be considered in all of the sections. Unfortunately, we've heard that argument before. It just doesn't work. You can't just make that. So I think POWES has played a really important role in a way. But still, the environment continues to be toxic in lots of ways. And I think we've all experienced that in this time, not in psychology or not, but so we want to one of the things that POWES offers, I think, and feminism as its legacy in psychology, is we found that a lot of people took a lot of joy from POWES, and feminist organizing in general. So stepping away from that individual, trying to engage with what is a complex and sometimes toxic world individually. It's not all sunshine and flowers, obviously, but there's something about the sense of being a part of something bigger. And I think Len Siegel in her wonderful book about radical happiness, Moments of Collective Joy, suggests that those participating in resistance to, or a process of collective deliberations on the harms of the present, sometimes trying to build alternatives, often do find in these strategies sources of fulfillment, resilience, and even moments of shared joy. And we really saw that coming through in our data and in our stories. So we hope this project has captured some of those strategies, some of the shared joy. It works to reestablish that history in a sense. However, it also aims to establish a legacy for the future, as Catherine indicated. So starting as I began, I guess, with a quote from Sarah Ahmed, the project, I would say, stands by the sentiment that we should not be willing to get over histories that are not over. So thank you very much. Hand you back to Sophie now.
Thanks very much, Rose. And thank you so much to Rose, Catherine and Lois, obviously, for the fascinating presentation and obviously for conducting the project and donating, making sure there's so much interesting material about feminist psychology, which is donated to the archive. It's so important. So thank you so much for that. I'll just say a little bit more about the History of Psychology Centre before we go on to questions. Just to say that, as I mentioned before, we had a review of HOPSI last year, which has given us some recommendations to improve our services in the archives. So we've started to implement these changes. We're moving our collections all to a single location, so it's easier to access for research. We've also recently been awarded a funding grant from the Arts, Humanities and Research Council for a collaborative doctoral award with the University of Leicester. And this is for a PhD student to work on our archive with the title for the PhD as an LGBTQIA+ Black and Marginalised History of the British Psychological Society from 1892 to 2022. And I'm sure as part of this PhD, they will also be looking at the material which has been spoken about today, so that's great. We're also looking to recruit for a new HOPSI advisory committee this year to provide specialist expertise to BPS staff on the archives. We're also planning on implementing a volunteer programme. We've got quite a big cataloguing backlog and repackaging project backlog at the moment. So we're wanting to get volunteers involved with that, giving people the opportunity to upskill in terms of heritage. And we're really working on creating an accessible collection so that parts of the archive like the POWES archive, which has now been donated over to us, can be accessible and used for future research. And just to say that, one of the ways we collect historically significant material is through donations of records from our members and from the public. So we recognise that there are many untold and overlooked stories within the history of UK psychology, which we want to capture in the archive, and we want to be active in our collecting of for the archive. And because of this, we're looking for records concerning minority groups and women who have impacted UK psychology. So donations can be about the work of a group, a movement, an individual, for example, community groups, individual psychologists, campaigners, activists, anyone who's had an impact on psychology. And obviously there have been some great examples spoken about by Rose, Lois and Catherine today in terms of what can be handed over to the archive and what we're looking for. There are some examples obviously on screen there. We're also very keen on suggestions for oral history participants as well. Like Lois was saying, oral history is a really great vehicle to capture hidden histories and histories which aren't traditionally captured within paper records. So we're always looking for suggestions for that as well. So if you want to get in touch with us, obviously in accessing the archive or for donations, our email is on the screen there. You can have a look at our archive catalogue as well, which is online and available for anybody. Even the public don't have to be a BPS member to view our catalogue. And obviously, if you get in touch, we will try to get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you so much. And we will take any questions. I will stop sharing. There we go. And let me look in. So let's have a look. So one question is, so number one, this is from Diana. So she says, thank you for this event and for all your work. How do you envision POWES to integrate and enrich the BPS in the years to come? And what would be the values you would consider at the top of your list to work towards? Yes, go Rose.
Shall I say something to that? And then maybe the others would like to say. I think that POWES, brings a lot to the BPS in different ways. I mean, obviously, we participate in a lot of the different organizations, like the research board and things like that, to which we contribute in lots of ways. We work together with other sections. For instance, the sexuality section, the qualitative section, the social section. I'm forgetting some history and psychology section, history and philosophy and psychology section. So we work developmental. We work with different sections to do things, and we've contributed a lot, I think, to different campaigns. Most recently, our Bridget Rickett and Paula Reevy and Maxine Woolhouse have been working on a big project around class, where they've been reporting to Parliament, and they've gone down to speak there around the really important issues around class. That if we look at intersectional analysis, is implicated in a different kind of way for women. So we've made interventions around the violence against women policy that's being introduced. Lois is particularly involved in that, so she might want to say some more about that. So we get involved in the kind of campaigns that the BPS is involved in, and we have people, on teaching committee and all the different committees, kind of making sure that there is an equity agenda and the kind of intersectional attention to things. Not that other people in the BPS aren't concerned with those things. I am not implying that at all, but I think that is our particular remit.
Thanks very much, Rose. And another question we have is, what do you think the POWES archive that you've collected tells us about wider UK psychology?
I have a little bit of an answer to that, and it also sort of links to the previous question as well. The area that I think it really importantly kind of contributes to is thinking about institutional histories. So I think that what this archive and the collection that we've managed to kind of collate and gather shows not only about the history of POWES and feminist psychology, but it also reflects quite a lot on the history of the BPS as an organisation, and how that relationship with feminism and feminists and the BPS has been tense and difficult at times. And so while it's wonderful that we've got events like this today and the BPS has supported our work and we're doing this, that history is like nuanced and challenging, and I think that that's an area that we're really kind of contributing here, that this is about institutional kind of recognition of its past, as well as like feminist recognition of pasts too.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Another question we have is, what was one of the most interesting or illuminating things you collected as part of the project? I know, Catherine, you were particularly taken with the tote bags, but was there anything else that you thought was particularly interesting that you collected over the project?
I mean, it's obviously so personal. I think that's what's so wonderful about having diverse and rich archives, that whoever goes to it is going to find something usually that really speaks to them. So for me, mine was definitely things like the tote bags and the kind of ephemeral objects, but also it was about finding Rose in the archive. I found really moving, and I was texting her like, oh my god, I found you. And I think that kind of thing is really important, because it's whatever is personal to you and then what links to you and is related to you. I'm also very invested in the kind of psychology sexuality section as well, and so seeing in the archive the collaboration between POWES and the what was initially the lesbian and gay section of the BPS, and the conversations between them, and like the POWES support for that section when it came up, that was really important and valuable to me as like a queer feminist. And so that was something that I found really moving, but I'm sure that other people would find whatever was relevant to them and personal to them moving. Lois, did you have anything that cropped up in the oral histories?
I guess you've just reminded me that kind of one of the things that I enjoyed about looking at them all broadly is kind of when somebody would mention, let's say, and that's the conference where I met Rose, and then Rose might say, and that's the conference where I met, you know, whoever else, and sort of seeing those connections across and seeing everybody's different perspectives of and what they thought was important to bring out of those shared events that kind of everybody was talking about. So I really enjoyed being able to see that across across them all. I think that was interesting. But as well, as I said, that kind of advice for future feminist psychologists, just because I'm only finishing my PhD now, so I was kind of constantly thinking, can I take this piece of information as well and like use it myself? And so yeah, but I'm sure there's lots of various pieces of information that people will find interesting.
Thank you. And we have time for maybe one or two other questions, but one other question that we've had is, were there any particular challenges you had with collecting for this archival project, and what were they, and how did you sort of overcome those? Anybody jump in, obviously.
Can I just say COVID?
Yes.
Yeah, COVID made everything a bit complicated and take a bit longer than maybe we had envisaged initially. Sure. But you know, we're not the only people with that story, are we?
Yeah. Sorry, Catherine, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think people have that sense that the materials that they had, they would be like, oh, but that's not important enough for this, and so we really had to encourage people that, like, no, we wanted their photos, we wanted their, you know, real life experiences, we wanted anything they had, and that was all valuable. Because I think often people think of archives as very important, organized, institutional, official kind of stuff, and we were really trying to break away from that idea that it all had to be the official minutes and documents, but actually everything and anything people had. And then once that message kind of got through, we were sort of inundated with some really lovely materials. So that was definitely an issue at one point, but we got through it.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I suppose, connected to that. Yeah, everybody always used to say, we're doing this, looking at key players within, feminist psychology, and everybody would say, I'm not a key person. And yeah, and COVID was an issue because I think we would have liked probably to do interviews in person. That would have been a bit nicer. And also, yeah, just the time that people had and everything, and also legal issues we struggled a lot with at the beginning in terms of kind of making things publicly available, didn't we, for a while? But I mean, all easily sorted out in the end. So
that's great, thank you. Well, I think, apologies to anyone else who's asked a question, I don't think we have time for any more, and we've reached the end of our allocated time, but it just obviously falls to me to say thank you so much again to Lois, Rose and Catherine for undertaking this project, for initiating the project, for collecting so much sort of interesting and valuable material, which, as you say, really enriches our archive. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending as well. Just to say that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available after, hopefully in a couple of weeks, on our YouTube channel. So thank you everyone so much, and have a great evening.